Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for electronic music techniques. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about MIDI editing, sequencing, as well as the pattern generator in Studio One, which is one of my favorite features. So to get started, let's go ahead and create an instance of an instrument we have not specifically created before, but let's use the Impact Drum Sampler. Now, if you are on Studio One Artist, this instrument is still available, and it does come with a limited library of sounds. However, it is easy to add your own drum samples to this instrument if you would like, or if you own the full version of Studio One, the professional version, you have a slightly larger collection of samples. And keep in mind, you can also purchase more sample kits directly from PreSonus's shop and numerous other locations as well. So if you've never worked with a drum sampler, well, it looks like this. And the drum sampler itself is a pretty straightforward instrument where when you click one of these drum pads, it will play the sound of the drum that is loaded into that particular sample. So it's kind of like our Sample One instrument, but designed for a little bit more of a sort of percussive interface to create drum patterns and that sort of stuff. You may have an outboard controller that has drum pads. Some keyboards have these things built in. I actually happen to own the Native Instruments Atom drum pad, which is great. It has sort of it's a physical device that looks almost exactly like this Impact XT. So I have a lot of the same buttons, knobs, and controls. And sometimes I use that when I'm creating rhythmic patterns. But as we're going to demonstrate today, it's also very easy to create rhythmic patterns with the Impact Drum Sampler just using a mouse, or if you'd like to use a keyboard, you can also play it that way. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's go ahead and load a preset here. And keep in mind, you may not have all of these, and that's okay. You should have some that you are able to download. As a reminder, if nothing is showing up there, go ahead and go to Studio One, check out Studio One installation, and then you should have some options here depending on the version you have running. I am actually currently running Studio One Artist, and under Instruments, the Impact Drum Kits, go ahead and select this and select Install. As you can see, mine is already installed. There are also some loop libraries that you may want to download, and some other sounds that could work with the Presence sampler, for example, if you want to download and explore those. So I'll just go ahead and pick a preset. How about we try this dark minimal, and let's sort of hear what this sounds like. It's going to load a drum sample into each pad for us. There we go. And now it actually shows me the keys on my keyboard that will associate with these, but I can also just click them. Okay. And again, because I have a keyboard and a drum sampler in front of me, I can also play them without clicking them. So pretty straightforward. In terms of this instrument, we're not going to explore it super in depth because I'm a little more concerned today with the actual MIDI editing. But you can load any sample you want into any of these slots. All you have to do is click and drag an audio file and drop it right here, or drop it right onto the pad itself. You can change a few things about how they work. For example, whether it's triggered as a one-shot, whether it loops. If I hold it down, or just once when I press it, I usually leave it here. We have the ability to quantize, we can offset, and then the few other things that are worth mentioning are these options right over here. So for example, this filter I think is really useful. We can put a filter on something and we can sort of just get rid of high frequency content. So this can be great for creating, really like low bassy hits, or just for creating a sort of more lo-fi sound where we don't get quite that upper, frequency resolution. And this works for every single drum sample. So you can individually fine tune them. We could add some resonance, maybe decrease the cutoff filter frequency. Okay. And then we also have an overall amplitude option, and we can also pan each of these separately. So for example, we could pan, the kick over here. Maybe the rim shot is over here. Okay, usually we would actually keep this pan center, and maybe this rim shot is right, and maybe this snare is a little bit left, maybe this clap is pretty far right. Whoops. And then actually this is good because I wanted to show this anyway, but we have multiple banks of samples that can be loaded all at once. So most of the defaults that come with Studio One are just on one sample page here on A. This one happens to have some on B as well. I found that most of the ones loaded in sample page B over here on this page tend to be really long, sort of more drawn out textural sounds. Okay, but that's all arbitrary. It could be anything. A lot of the sort of more standard percussion hits that you're looking for making drum patterns, they all live usually on this A page. We can also reverse these drum samples, which that sounds kind of funny in this case. Okay. We can also normalize them. So if you're bringing in an audio file of your own, most of these are normalized by default if they come with Studio One. So they are all sort of at their own amplitude. Now, depending on the kit that you create, if I have my little mixer, I will just show you that it usually ends up sending different drums out different audio tracks. So we have the ability to do some amount of mixing. So for example, my kick comes out the main out, but maybe this percuss 3, notice it comes out on a separate track. And they don't all come out on separate tracks. They sort of come out in groups. So you can see which drums are going to which location, but it creates multiple outputs for us by default, so that if we want to have different effects on different groups of drums, we can do so. If we want to send, maybe we want to send my snare to the reverb, but we don't want to send the kick, or maybe we want to really compress the kick, but not something else. We have some cool flexible audio routing options in my mixer. I can label these if I want to label them based off their drums and sort of decide how that's going to work for us from a slightly more specific audio routing option. And in case you're curious, you can actually see which output these drums are being sent to, and we can change this just by right-clicking on this corner, and we can decide whether to send it out one of our existing stereo outputs. We could create new stereo outputs. We could create mono outputs, however you'd like to do it. Quite often, I'm fine with how they're defined by default, like where they're naturally grouped on audio tracks. You could also just make them go out all on one track if you wanted to. You could just sort of bring everything to stereo impact 1, and then everything is just going to come out that main out. A lot of flexibility in how you route these. It really depends on what you want to do with them after the fact. But again, that's not really the topic for the day. Rather, I'm more concerned about how we can actually edit and sort of work with this MIDI data from these drum samples themselves. So by default, I could, as we've talked about before, if I wanted to, I could, hit record and then, record some actual MIDI. Let's make sure that my, I'm not going to have that click and play, but I'm going to pre-count, and let's make sure that I have my metronome going, and let's go ahead and just record a few notes. Oh, but you know what? That's way too slow. And I'm also in 5/4 time, and I want to change that to 4/4 time. Let's bring this up to 120. Why not? The chosen tempo. Oh, not 118, 120. There we go. And let's go ahead and record some data. Okay, so let's just stick right there with a really simple little rhythmic idea to begin with. I can double click this, see it in my MIDI editor, and I can hit return, and I can hear what I recorded. Okay, so not perfect. My timing's not great. I could quantize, or I could just, move some of these things manually a little bit, whatever I'd like to do to make this work. Now, one thing you might notice, this looks a little different than my editor before when I was entering music on my, MIDI synthesizer. That's because Studio One recognizes that this is a drum sampler, and it makes my track and my editor look like this accordingly. If you want it to look like a piano roll, you can just click that, and then we can kind of see our slightly more familiar view. But for instruments that are, drum samplers, we really just care about when we hit the thing, and that's kind of all we're interested in. So I can do a lot of the same things here. I can hit Control in my case, or Command if you're on a Mac. If you have set it up accordingly, I can just click notes in anywhere I want along the grid. I can increase the rhythm, the resolution. I could just add. This is not going to be good, but let's hear what it sounds like. You know what? I'll be honest, I don't hate that as much as I thought I was going to. So, you could have a really great time just working with this view here, and you could create some really cool drum parts. We could extend this region out. Maybe we end up coming up with some little groove. Like, let's say we like all this. I could just select this all and copy. I could put my playhead right here, and I could just repeat that. But maybe I add a couple of notes, on the next iteration, and maybe I just select a note and then hit delete and get rid of a couple on this next iteration. And suddenly I have, some kind of rhythmic idea that I've built over time. This is not perfect, but you get the idea. Let's hear kind of how this evolves. Okay, so it's a little much. It's kind of arrhythmic, but it's kind of cool. But you can see what I'm talking about. We can see all of my individual drum hits over here. We can click them to audition them. We can also just write them in. We could just, write a bunch of them. Just click and hold. I can't even keep up with how many samples I want to play there. We can also adjust the velocity of any of these notes if we select them. Any note that is sort of in that lane, all of these hi-hat hits versus, this percussion one, there's no hits, so we don't see anything. My kick drum, I can change these. Some of these are velocity sensitive, some are not. In this case, it sounds like this kick is velocity sensitive, so I could really, and this kick is a little too close. We could really have the kick just thwomping the whole time. Okay, again, sounding a little little industrial grunge, but it works, and you get the idea that this MIDI editor for drums works very similarly to how it's worked on past instruments. We can add notes, we can edit them, we can change pitch bend, we can do all sorts of stuff to any of these notes. We can resize and really get a greater resolution for our velocity, whatever it is you'd like to do. This might be how you prefer to work. You might create some little pattern like this, and then you might just, duplicate this region, and just by hitting the keyboard command of D, and suddenly I just have this cool little pattern that's looping, and I'm ready to go. Okay, now, again, not necessarily the greatest pattern ever written, so just for the time being, I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to show you what I think is the much better way to sequence drums and even melodic ideas, which I'll also demonstrate, which is using what is called the pattern generator. So what we had a second ago, when I made this little musical region here, this is what we call a part. And by default, you can see here, it's labeled a part. We can convert it to a pattern with this option. So anytime I create a region, and I tell you what, I'm going to, for the time being, I'm going to make this smaller. I'm going to make this just like 1 bar that matches my actual tempo. So I'm going to have 1 bar of 4/4. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because patterns by default are the same length as your meter that you're set to. So if I'm in 4/4 time and I create a pattern, it's going to make a pattern in 4/4 time. So I'm going to draw this part, and then I'm going to convert part to pattern, which is also under musical functions, which is also under instrument parts, and I can insert pattern or insert instrument part or convert part to pattern. We can go either way with these. So in this case, I'm going to convert part to pattern. Now, it doesn't look any different at first, but once I double click, this is where it gets more interesting. So here I have a whole different approach to drum sequencing that might look like a drum sequencer that you may have worked with before, either in another piece of software or like an actual physical drum sequencer. So here is my pattern editor, and it looks very similar to the part editor I was using for drums a minute ago, but there are a few key differences. Just to show you, we can also view it from a melodic view, which we will demonstrate with the MIDI synth in a minute, but I tend to work in the drum mode for a lot of my percussion work, and it's really similar. I can just click notes in wherever I want. So I could lay down like a 4 on the floor idea. We see them populate up here. Okay, we could add other elements. So maybe I want to have, this little sound here, maybe like so. And I don't know. I kind of like this ride cymbal, but it's a little hot. So let's filter it and get rid of a little more. There we go. So then let's have something like. Cool. And now it's not repeating, but we will make it repeat in a second. And I don't know, maybe this is on beat 4. But it's also kind of hot, so maybe let's bring that down a little, and let's also filter out some of the high frequency content. Let's make it a little more resonant though. There we go. I kind of like that. Cool, this is starting to sound kind of interesting. So by default, this seems like, okay, well, it's exactly the same as before. So let me show you some of the features that are cool. One, just automatically, this is now a pattern that is 1 bar length. You'll notice that there are like 16 steps along the way, which represent our 16th notes, and we would have 4 16th notes in 4/4 time. And you'll notice that now I can just drag this out without having to like duplicate and hitting that D command over and over again. So this is a much quicker way to loop regions of this pattern that's a little bit more like we might expect compared to other pieces of software like Logic or Ableton. And I could just loop this forever. I could drag this out as long as I want. How about we do 4 full bars of it for the time being? Cool. Now, a few things that are possible here that we couldn't easily do in the other option or do them at all. One, I can choose any lane, and I can do a couple of cool things. I could set every 4th step to do like a 4 on the floor thing. I could choose another lane and do every 2nd step. If I choose every 2nd step on another lane, I could also offset them by 1, so I have them alternating. I could also just fill a whole lane, but that's going to get pretty loud. Let's do this where we just fill everything. Or I could fill a lane and then maybe decide I don't want it, and I could just clear that lane, or I could fill a lane and then selectively remove just by hovering my mouse over it. And now it might not sound great, but it's going to have a lot more notes. Okay, so this This snare is probably a little hot, and so is this one right here. So maybe we could take this percussion 3, maybe we could just turn it down. And this snare is also a little hot. Let's filter this. You know, that's actually sounding kind of cool. That's kind of cool. All right, so we have shown how we can quickly add some elements here, and I think that that can be kind of cool, but some of the things that are really powerful with this editor, this pattern editor, are when we start to change some of our default timing resolutions. So for example, I could change the number of steps in this sequence to be greater or less than my actual meter, and you'll notice that it actually fills in. What I think is really fun is to do a number of steps that is like different from your meter. Like if we have 4/4 time where we have 16 16th notes, what if you do like, you can just double click to choose, and what if I did like, you know, 15 steps? Well, now it's going to constantly be moving like in and out of sync with the overall time signature of my piece, and I can create some really cool rhythmic effects, but I could also do that at a smaller level. So just for a second, I'm going to just sort of clear all of these. And again, I could do that either by selecting a lane, you know, and hitting here, or sometimes it's quicker to just kind of hover the mouse over and erase them all, as long as you start on an erase note. I think this option is pretty cool because I can, for example, have my kick do a 4 on the floor, like I was talking about. But what if I want this snare? Or how about this hi-hat too? What if I want this hi-hat to kind of move at a different pace? Well, you'll notice I can choose the number of steps that are available in this lane individually. I can choose the step size, or I could say, how about there are 15 16th notes? And you'll notice it grays one of these out. And now, if I have this hat begin, also doing a 4 on the floor, it's going to move in and out of phase by 1/16th note with each iteration. So I'll loop this out so we can get more examples. So notice how this lane is offset by a greater amount, and then eventually it works its way back into phase and then out again. So I think this creates really interesting and exciting rhythmic parts with minimal effort. How about we add this here as well? And how about this case? This has, I don't know, 13 steps, some weird odd number. All right, now let's hear these move in and out of phase. Okay, now I might continue to tweak this, but this automatically generates a rhythmic part and a drum pattern that is way more interesting to me, at least aesthetically, because I have a lot of variation from it. And maybe 13 is not the right number. Maybe this should in fact be 14. And now let's hear the result. And as a reminder, what I mentioned a second ago, how about this crash? We can also change it so that this lane is running on 8th notes instead, and maybe instead of having 16, it has 8 of them, so it takes up the same location, like the same span, but now we have fewer instances of it to worry about along the way. This comes in especially handy with melodic writing with the pattern editor, which we'll look at in a minute. So even this option of having all these lanes at different resolutions can make really, really cool musical patterns. How about this one only has 7, so very few. Okay, so I think that's pretty cool. We can also see what the number of steps are and resolution for my global pattern, which is controlled up here, in case we want to change that, or if we want to make a new pattern. We can also click new variation, which is going to make a new variation that's sort of from scratch in case we want to do so. I'm going to undo that. We can also simply duplicate the variation and get variation 1 so that as time goes on, maybe we want to have, we can actually choose. Notice how this region changes from variation 1 to another. We may want to have these variations evolve over time. So we have one variation for 8 bars, then another variation that's just slightly different as time goes on. And we can drag variation 1 onto my timeline, and then we could leave this as, the original impact. And then over here, let's select variation 1 and let's add some stuff. Cool. So now we'll hear kind of the tail end of the original version and then variation 1. So it's a really great way to have drum parts sort of evolve over time and add or remove layers and create some really interesting textures. And keep in mind, anytime I have one of these selected, I can change from one variation to another and it updates in real time, just as over here, I can move this back to the original. I could also create new variations anytime and create duplicates so that I can easily sort of build on each of these as I go. So let me show you then one of my other absolute favorite features of this pattern editor. And I'm just going to delete, again, most of my notes here. And I'm going to create a sort of new idea from scratch and talk about how it can be really dynamically exciting with some randomness. So let's just throw a bunch of kicks down and let's hear how those sound. So the artistic masterpiece of the century, the running kick. It sounds fine. But one of the features that's really cool is this little option down here that lets us show/hide automation lanes. And we can automate a few things that we could not automate in our normal part editor. So we can change velocity. So, we could have some variation here. We just draw along freehand. Okay, so that already makes this line more interesting. We can also make notes repeat. This is particularly cool with certain hi-hat sounds. So here we have a hi-hat. And let's add it on just all 4 beats. What if this third one had 3 iterations of it? And maybe this one has 2, So that already gets a really cool sort of drum sequencer sound that would be difficult to achieve with the normal part editor. But my absolute favorite option here is probability. So on any note that we add in any given lane, as long as the lane is selected, we will see the probability that that note strikes. So for example, if I bring these all down to 0, now we will not hear that kick. So what if they're all at around 50%? We should hear, about half of them. I think that's pretty cool. What if it was, fairly high probability, but not a guarantee that each one will hit? So now every time through the pattern, it's slightly different. And to me, that's wonderful because I like, sort of square rhythmic patterns, but I like them to have variation and evolve and grow over time. And this keeps your listener really engaged and excited. They never know exactly what drum part is going to hit on any given beat. In fact, I think it can be fun to just fill a ton of these, right? Just have a ridiculous amount of drum hits to the point where this would normally sound like garbage because we're just going to have everything all at once. And let me go back here and let's change the probability all the way back up. Okay, so not the finest sounding musical example, but what if each of these, let's keep the kick relatively high because I like that, but what if the rest of these all had a pretty small chance of ever firing? So that each time through the pattern, we get a ridiculously different combination of sounds, but we still keep our sort of rhythmic regularity. And we also still have some of these patterns moving in and out of phase with each other, so we'll have randomness combined with sort of different phasing. And let's hear what this sounds like. So I think that's pretty cool. And keep in mind, we could, have this go for any duration. We could also create a new variation from it, bring that over, and then we could edit this variation. So maybe on this variation, the probability of everything goes way down so that we have a sort of decreased structure so that it becomes more minimal over time. Cool. So this pattern editor is something that you may want to explore greatly on your own, and it is required for the use of your impact drum part on your final project. And there are some other great resources if you really want to explore the sort of nooks and crannies of this, but everything I've shown you is typically what I tend to use on this. I tend to be really interested in actually making my drums sound the way I want with, the actual impact sampler. I care about the timing and placement of those drums, and then I care about the pattern and probability and sort of phase issues by creating different number of steps. And I think it sounds really cool. So then the last thing to show today is that we can also use patterns for melodic instruments. Don't feel like it just has to be rhythmic ones. So for example, I could control click and draw out a little part, and then I can right click and I can convert to pattern. So here I have my sort of melodic pattern editor, and we have the same options where we can choose like probability and velocity, and we can also change the number of steps and the resolution of my overall sequence, and we can change them on individual lanes if we switch back to the percussion mode. But the thing that I can do here in the melodic editor for a melodic instrument that I kind of like is I can click and drag notes so that they last for a certain duration of time. So what if I had, like a little C minor sort of chord here in second inversion that lasts for 2 beats, and then maybe I want to have, how about like a fairly high F minor? And then maybe I want to have, how about D flat major for 1 beat? D, F, and A flat. So we have some continuity there. Let's just hear just this little part here. Okay, so that's kind of cool. And keep in mind, we could just drag this out and repeat it if we wanted to continue hearing that. And similarly, we could add probability to any one of these particular notes, particularly once we're on the lane that is selected here. And we could just, decrease the probability that we get any of these particular notes at any particular time. We can also view it. I just have to scroll to where these notes are. We could view them right here as well. So we could select a lane and we could choose the probability that any of these notes are going to occur at any given time. And now we might not get the full sort of harmonic pattern that we had going on before. So I'm missing some notes on certain iterations. I think that can be kind of cool. And I can also create variations by either adding a new one or simply duplicating this variation. And then I could, make this region the original, and then maybe I drag variation 1 over. And then maybe here in variation 1, this becomes, I don't know, instead of an F minor chord, becomes an F major chord. And maybe it's just a subtle harmonic difference. Okay, so melodically, harmonically, rhythmically, drum pattern-wise, whatever it is you'd like to do, the pattern editor is my preferred way to go. Studio One was one of the earlier digital audio workstations to introduce a pattern editor quite like this, and now others are starting to introduce it as well, so it's a good feature to learn. And it's a tremendously powerful, interesting, and dynamic way to create all sorts of musical parts that you otherwise might not come up with on your own. So please explore, use for your final project, and really see what you can get out of this incredibly powerful feature. Lean into the idea of probability and repeats and variations, and you can create some really wonderful, wonderful music.